"Don't you know me, Cowboy?" The voice cut through the low hum of the saloon like a wind that didn't belong, soft but steady, carrying something heavier than sound, and every head turned, slow, uncertain, as if the room itself wasn't ready to hear what came next. Because in a place like Dust Hollow, strangers didn't walk in asking questions like that, not unless they were ready to leave with answers they might not survive. And yet she stood there in the doorway, boots dusted from miles of dry road, dark hair catching the last gold of the evening sun, her eyes fixed on one man and one man only, Ethan Calloway, who sat with his back half turned, a glass untouched in front of him, like he had been waiting for something he couldn't name. And when her words reached him, his fingers paused against the rim, not trembling, not quite still either, just caught somewhere in between, like a memory trying to decide if it should rise or stay buried. And for a moment, no one spoke, not the card players, not the bartender. Wiping the same spot twice, not even the old piano in the corner that had been out of tune since last winter, because something in the air had shifted, something quiet but undeniable, and Ethan slowly turned his head, just enough to see her, without fully facing what she brought with her, his eyes narrowing not in anger but in distance, the kind a man builds over years when forgetting becomes easier than remembering. And when he finally spoke, his voice came out low, even, almost indifferent. "You got the wrong man," he said, and a few men chuckled, quick and uneasy, because they knew how this town worked, knew what it meant when someone like her stepped into a place like this. But she didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't back down the way most would under a dozen staring eyes. Instead, she took a step forward, slow enough to show she wasn't afraid, steady enough to show she wasn't leaving. And the wooden floor gave a soft creak beneath her weight, the only sound brave enough to move between them. And then she said it again, quieter this time, but sharper somehow. "Look at me." And that was when Ethan did, fully now, turning his body, his chair scraping just enough to break the stillness. And for a heartbeat that stretched longer than it should, something flickered across his face, not recognition, not yet, but something close enough to make him look twice. And outside, beyond the thin walls of the saloon, the wind carried dust across the street where a few figures had begun to gather, silent, waiting, as if the land itself knew this moment had been coming long before either of them did. And inside, with every eye watching and every breath held, she reached into the fold of her dress, not hurried, not hidden, just deliberate, like she had nothing to prove and everything to reveal. And Ethan's hand hovered near his side, not on a weapon, not ready to fight, but not entirely at ease either, because somewhere deep beneath the years and the choices and the silence he had chosen, something old was beginning to stir, something he had buried under dust and distance. And it did not ask for permission to return. The room did not breathe. It only waited, as her fingers closed around something small and worn. And when she brought it into the light, the gold of the setting sun caught against its surface just enough to make a few men lean forward without realizing it. A child's bracelet, simple leather, faded by years, marked with careful cuts that had once been sharp but now softened by time and touch. And she held it not like a weapon, not like proof to win an argument, but like something that had survived longer than it should have, something that remembered even when people chose not to. And Ethan's eyes dropped to it before he could stop them. Just a glance, just a second, but it was enough, because something behind his steady expression shifted, barely visible, like dust lifting off old wood when no one is watching. And he let out a quiet breath through his nose, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Anyone can carve a piece of leather," he said, his voice calm, measured, the kind a man uses when he is building a wall, one word at a time. And a few men nodded, eager to agree, eager to keep things simple, because simple meant safe. But she did not lower the bracelet, did not argue, did not raise her voice. She only stepped closer, one slow step that carried the scent of sage and open land into the room, and placed it on the table in front of him, not pushing it, not demanding, just leaving it there where it could not be ignored. And for a moment, Ethan did not touch it, his hand resting inches away, fingers still, like the distance between them was heavier than it looked. And outside, the wind shifted direction, carrying with it the faint sound of horses, not fast, not loud, just present. And a man near the window glanced out. then froze, his expression tightening in a way that did not match the easy laughter from moments before, because across the street, shapes had formed, riders sitting tall and still, not moving, not approaching, simply waiting like they had all the time in the world. And inside, the silence deepened, pressing in from the walls, settling into the spaces between words, and Ethan finally moved, his fingers brushing the bracelet, not picking it up yet, just touching it like a man testing if something is real or just another trick his mind is playing on him. And the second his skin met the worn leather, something flickered again, sharper this time. Not a full memory, not clear enough to trust, but enough to make his jaw tighten, enough to make his eyes linger longer than they should have. And she watched him, not with triumph, not with accusation, but with a quiet patience that made the moment feel longer than it was, as if she had already waited years, and a few more seconds would not change anything. And when he finally lifted the bracelet, turning it slightly, the marks caught the light again, uneven lines that once meant nothing more than a boy passing time by a riverbank. And his thumb traced one of them without thinking, just a small movement, almost nothing, but enough to make him still, because something about that line felt familiar in a way he could not explain, and he exhaled slowly, setting the bracelet back down with more care than he intended. "You should leave," he said, quieter now, not cold, not kind, just distant, like he was speaking to something he did not want to face. And she tilted her head slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "If I leave," she said, her voice steady as the horizon, "then you will keep pretending you do not remember." And that was when the room shifted again, not with movement, not with sound, but with the weight of something unspoken settling between them, something that did not belong to the town, or the people, or even the present moment, but to a promise made long ago under a sky that neither of them had forgotten. Even if one of them had tried, no one laughed this time. Not even the men who had been eager to fill silence with noise just minutes ago, because something in her words had settled deeper than comfort allowed, and Ethan felt it before he understood it. That quiet pressure behind his ribs, like a door he had closed long ago, was now being tested from the other side, not with force, but with patience, and patience was always harder to ignore, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, as if distance could make the moment smaller, easier to control. But the bracelet still sat there between them, unmoving, undeniable, and his eyes kept returning to it without permission, like it carried a gravity he could not resist. And outside, the riders had not moved, not a single inch, their horses calm, their posture steady, not threatening, not welcoming, just present in a way that made the town feel smaller than it had that morning. And one of the men near the window cleared his throat, shifting his weight, unsure whether to stay or step out, because whatever this was, it no longer belonged to the usual rules of Dust Hollow. And inside, Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, a small sound, but sharp enough to break the stillness. And he spoke again, slower this time, choosing each word like it mattered more than before. "People remember things wrong," he said, his voice carrying that same steady tone, but now there was something beneath it, something not as certain as it had been, and she watched him with that same quiet patience, her expression unchanged, as if she had expected this, as if she had seen it play out in her mind long before she stepped through those doors. And she shook her head once, not in disagreement, but in something softer, something closer to understanding. "Not this," she said, and her gaze dropped briefly to the bracelet before returning to him. "You made it when your hands were too small to hold a knife steady," she continued, her voice calm, almost distant, like she was speaking to a memory instead of a man. "You kept slipping, cutting the lines too deep on one side, too light on the other, and you got angry because it did not look the way you wanted." And the room seemed to lean in without moving, drawn by the way she spoke, not loud, not urgent, but certain in a way that left no room for doubt. And Ethan's jaw tightened again, because the details were too specific, too precise to dismiss as chance. And yet he tried, because trying was easier than accepting, and he let out a breath, shaking his head slightly. "You heard a story somewhere," he said, but the words did not land the way they should have, not even to his own ears, and she took another step closer, close enough now that the dust on her boots marked the floor beside his chair. close enough that he could see the faint lines of time at the corners of her eyes, not from age, but from years spent under open sky and hard choices, and she lowered her voice just enough that it felt like it belonged only to him, even though everyone heard it. "You cried when I laughed at you," she said, and for the first time, something real broke through his control, not a full memory, not clear, but sharp enough to make him still completely, because he could hear it now, faint but there, the echo of a younger voice, his own, frustrated, determined, and another voice beside it. Softer, teasing, not unkind, just honest, and the air in his chest shifted, like he had forgotten how to breathe properly and was only now remembering. And outside, one of the riders adjusted in the saddle, not impatient, not signaling, just acknowledging the passing of time, and inside, Ethan did not look at the men, did not look at the door, did not look anywhere but at her, because for the first time since she walked in, leaving was no longer the easiest option, and the distance he had built over years was beginning to feel thinner than he had ever intended. The silence stretched until it felt like something that could break if anyone moved too quickly, and Ethan did not move at all, not his hands, not his shoulders, not even his breath, because what she had said did not fade the way ordinary words did. It lingered, settling into places he had kept untouched for years, and he could see it now, not clearly, not fully, but enough to make his chest tighten. A river cutting through stone, sunlight flickering on water, a boy kneeling at the edge with a piece of leather in his hand, jaw set in stubborn focus, and beside him, a girl watching, arms folded, her voice light with laughter that did not mock but refused to pretend, and the image slipped as quickly as it came, leaving behind only the feeling of it, and Ethan blinked once, slow, as if clearing dust from his eyes, but the room did not return to what it had been, because once something rises, even for a second, it leaves a mark, and he leaned forward just slightly, his forearms resting on the table now, closer to the bracelet than before, closer to her, though he would not have said it that way, and his voice, when it came, had lost something, not strength, not control, but distance. "You are telling stories," he said, but the words no longer carried certainty, and she saw that, not with triumph, not with relief, but with the same steady calm that had carried her through the door, because this was never about proving him wrong. It was about letting him see what was already his. And she lowered herself into the empty chair across from him without asking, the wood creaking softly under her weight, a simple act that would have caused tension any other day. But now no one stopped her, no one spoke, because whatever line had existed between her and this place had already been crossed the moment she said his name. And she rested her hands on the table, palms open, not reaching, not demanding, just present, and she spoke again, softer, as if the room had grown too small for anything louder. "You said you would come back before the first snow," she said, and the words landed differently, not sharp, not sudden, but heavy, like something placed carefully in front of him, and Ethan's fingers curled slightly against the wood, because that was not a detail a stranger could guess. Not a story that traveled between towns. That was something spoken under a sky that belonged only to two people. And he exhaled through his nose, longer this time, his gaze dropping again to the bracelet. And he picked it up without thinking, turning it in his hands, feeling the grooves, the uneven edges, and his thumb paused over a small notch, barely noticeable, but placed with intent, and something in him recognized it, not with clarity, but with familiarity that could not be denied. And outside, the riders remained where they were, patient as stone, the kind of patience that does not ask for anything because it already knows the outcome will come, one way or another. And inside, a chair scraped lightly as someone shifted, then another, until one by one, the men who had filled the room began to step back, not leaving entirely, but creating space, instinctively, as if they understood that what was unfolding did not belong to them. And Ethan finally looked up again, meeting her eyes fully now, not with dismissal, not with challenge, but with something quieter, something uncertain, and he spoke her name before he realized he knew it, the sound low, almost lost under his breath, Ayana. And the moment it left him, the room changed, not with noise, not with movement, but with the simple weight of recognition finally finding its way back home. The name did not echo, it settled, quiet and certain, like it had always been there waiting for him to say it again, and Ayana did not smile, did not react the way the room expected, because this was not a victory, it was a return, and returns are never loud. They are heavy, and Ethan felt it in the way his chest tightened, not with fear, not with regret, but with something deeper, something that had no easy word, and his hand remained around the bracelet, his thumb still resting on that small notch as if it anchored him to something real, and he looked at her again, not searching now, not questioning, just seeing, truly seeing for the first time since she walked in, the lines of her face shaped by years he had not been there for, the steadiness in her eyes that had once been lighter, younger, and he exhaled slowly. "You were not supposed to come here," he said, and his voice carried something new, not distance, not denial, but a quiet weight of understanding, and she tilted her head slightly, the movement small, almost thoughtful. "Neither were you," she replied, and the words landed gently. But they did not miss, because Ethan knew exactly what she meant, even if he had never said it out loud, even if he had spent years building a life that did not include the past she carried so easily, and outside. The riders shifted again, not closer, not further, just present, a reminder that this moment was not standing alone, that it had consequences beyond the walls of the saloon, and inside. The men who had stayed began to step back even more, giving space without being told, because something about the way the two of them sat across from each other made interruption feel like a mistake no one wanted to make, and Ethan set the bracelet down carefully this time, not as something he could dismiss, but as something that deserved to stay where it was, and he ran a hand along his jaw, slow, thoughtful, as if trying to piece together something that had been scattered too long. "I thought you," he began, then stopped, because the thought did not finish the way he expected, and she watched him, not rushing, not filling the silence, just letting him find his way through it. And after a moment, he tried again. "I thought that part was over," he said, and this time the words came clearer, though they carried less certainty than before. And Ayana's gaze softened just slightly, not with pity, not with judgment, but with something closer to truth. "It does not end just because you leave it behind," she said, and there was no accusation in it. Only a quiet statement of fact, the kind that does not need to be defended, and Ethan let out a breath that felt heavier than the last, his eyes drifting briefly toward the door, toward the light that had dimmed as the sun dropped lower, toward the silhouettes that waited without moving. And he knew then that this was not just about remembering, not just about a promise made by a boy who did not understand the weight of his own words. This was about something larger, something he had stepped away from without realizing it would follow him, and he looked back at her, meeting her eyes again, and there was no denial left there now, only the quiet struggle of a man standing between who he had become and who he once was. And he spoke carefully, as if each word mattered more than the last. "Why now?" he asked, and it was not a challenge, not a rejection, just a question that had been waiting longer than he realized, and Ayana did not answer immediately, her gaze shifting briefly toward the window, toward the waiting riders, then back to him, and when she spoke, her voice was steady, but there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there before, something that carried the weight of years and the distance between them. "Because you were not the only one who remembered," she said, and the way she said it made the room feel smaller, like the walls had moved closer without anyone noticing, and Ethan felt it, that quiet shift, that sense that whatever came next would not allow him to return to the man he had been just hours ago. And for the first time since she walked in, he did not try to stop it. The words did not rush. They settled slowly between them, and Ethan felt them in a place deeper than thought, deeper than reason, because this was no longer about what he remembered. It was about what had remained, whether he chose to face it or not. And he leaned back slightly, his chair creaking under the shift, not as a retreat, but as a man trying to take in something larger than the space around him. And his eyes moved once more to the window, to the silhouettes beyond the fading light. And he noticed something he had not before. They were not watching the town. They were watching him, not with hostility, not with challenge, but with a kind of quiet expectation that carried more weight than any threat could. And he let out a slow breath, his hand lifting from the table to rest briefly against his chest, as if grounding himself in the present. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, steadier, but no longer guarded. "You did not come alone," he said, and it was not a question, and Ayanna followed his gaze for a moment before returning it to him, her expression unchanged but her silence confirming more than words would have, and Ethan nodded once, almost to himself, as if a piece of the larger picture had finally settled into place, and he reached for the glass in front of him, not to drink, just to hold, the cool surface anchoring him while his thoughts moved somewhere far from the saloon, far from the town, back to a place where the air smelled of water and sun-warmed stone, where promises had felt simple because the world had been smaller then, and he set the glass back, down without lifting it to his lips, because whatever thirst he had was not the kind a drink could answer, and he looked at her again, studying her not as a stranger, not even as someone returning from the past, but as someone who had carried something forward while he had chosen to leave it behind, and there was a quiet respect in that realization, one he did not speak but did not hide either, and he leaned forward slightly now, his forearms resting on the table once more, closer than before. And his voice, when it came, held a weight that had not been there earlier. "What do they want?" he asked, and this time there was no attempt to distance himself from it, no effort to pretend it was not his concern, and Ayanna did not answer immediately, her gaze drifting for a brief moment to the bracelet still resting between them, then back to him, and she reached out, not to take it, but to turn it slightly, aligning it so that the small notch faced him again, a subtle movement, but deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice carried something new, something deeper. "They want to see if you remember the promise the way I do," she said, and Ethan's brow tightened slightly, not in confusion, but in recognition that was not yet complete, and he glanced down at the bracelet, at that small mark his fingers had traced moments ago, and the memory stirred again, stronger this time, not just a feeling, but a fragment of words spoken under open sky, a boy's voice, his own, saying something that had felt certain then, something about coming back, about not leaving things unfinished, and his chest tightened again, not with pain, but with the weight of understanding slowly finding its place, and he looked up at her, meeting her eyes with a steadiness that matched her own now, and for the first time since she had walked in, there was no hesitation in him, only the quiet realization that whatever he had tried to bury had not been buried deeply enough to stay there, and outside, one of the riders shifted again, a subtle movement that carried across the still air, not impatient, not demanding, just present, like time itself waiting for a man to decide which version of himself would stand when the moment finally arrived. The air felt heavier now, not because anything had changed, but because everything had, and Ethan knew it in the way his thoughts no longer moved in circles, no longer looking for a way out, but instead settling into a single line that led forward whether he was ready or not. And he sat there for a moment longer, the bracelet still between them, the room still holding its breath, the riders still waiting beyond the fading light, and then he reached for it again, this time. Not as a question, not as doubt, but as something he was willing to carry, and his fingers closed around the worn leather with a steadiness that had been missing before, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet weight, but now it was grounded, certain in a way that did not need to be loud. "I said I would come back before the first snow," he murmured, more to himself than to her, but she heard it, and the smallest shift in her gaze told him that what he had just spoken was not guesswork, not assumption, but memory finally finding its place, and he exhaled slowly, the sound low, almost lost under the stillness of the room, and he set the bracelet down again, but this time he did not let his hand drift away from it, his fingers resting beside it like he was not ready to lose contact again, and he looked at her fully, no hesitation left, no distance to hide behind. "I did not come back," he said, and there was no excuse in it, no defense, just truth, simple and unguarded, and Ayanna held his gaze without judgment, without softness either, just the same steady presence that had carried her through every word so far. "No," she said quietly, and the word did not accuse, it confirmed, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because some truths do not need more than that, and outside, the light had dropped lower, shadows stretching across the street, the riders now darker shapes against a sky that was losing its color, and one of the men near the door shifted again, as if uncertain whether to stay or leave, but no one moved, not yet, because whatever decision was coming, it had not reached them. It was still between the two at the table. And Ethan leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting once more to the window, to the waiting figures. And he understood now, not completely, but enough, that this was not about what had been said years ago, not just about a boy's promise, but about what that promise had meant to someone who had believed it, carried it, waited with it. And he turned back to her, his expression steady, but there was something else there now, something that had not been present before, something like acceptance, or maybe something closer to responsibility. And he spoke again, slower this time, as if each word had to be placed carefully. "And now they want to know if I still mean it," he said. And it was not a question, not really. And Ayanna nodded once, a small movement, but final in its own way, and the room seemed to settle around that understanding. As if the moment had been building toward this exact point from the second she stepped through the door, and Ethan's hand finally moved away from the bracelet, not to distance himself from it, but because he no longer needed to hold it to remember what it stood for. And he rested his palm flat against the table, steady, grounded, and for the first time since the moment began, he did not look at her, did not look at the bracelet, did not look at the men around them. He looked toward the door, toward the fading light, toward the riders who had not moved an inch since they arrived. And he knew, with a quiet certainty that settled deep in his chest, that whatever came next would not be decided by words alone, but by whether he chose to stand where he once said he would. And this time, he did not look away. The decision did not arrive with noise. It settled into Ethan the way the first cold of winter settles into the ground, quiet, inevitable. And once it was there, it did not leave. And he pushed his chair back slowly, the wood scraping against the floor just enough to remind everyone in the room that something had shifted from words to action. And no one spoke, not the men who had watched from the corners, not the bartender who had long since stopped pretending to clean the same glass, because they all understood that whatever came next was not meant for them. And Ethan stood, straightening without urgency, without hesitation, like a man who had already made his choice before his body caught up to it. And his eyes moved once to Ayanna, not asking, not seeking approval, just acknowledging her presence in this moment that had been set in motion long before either of them could have stopped it. And she remained seated for a heartbeat longer, watching him with that same steady gaze, and then she rose as well, the movement smooth, unforced, as if she had always known he would stand when the time came. And together they turned toward the door, not side by side, not yet, but moving in the same direction. And as Ethan stepped forward, the men nearest to him shifted out of the way without being asked, instinct guiding them more than thought, because something in his posture had changed, something that did not invite challenge, did not invite question, only space. And the saloon doors creaked as he pushed them open, the evening air meeting him with the scent of dust and cooling earth. And outside, the riders remained where they had been, lined along the edge of the street, still as they had been when they arrived, their presence no louder than the wind itself. And for a moment, Ethan stood just beyond the threshold, the light behind him fading as the sky stretched into deeper shades of blue and gold. And he took in the sight of them, not as strangers, not as a threat, but as something connected to a part of his life he had tried to leave behind. And he stepped forward onto the dirt, each footfall steady, measured, closing the distance one step at a time until he stood where the town ended and the open land began. And the riders did not move, not even when he stopped, not even when Ayanna stepped out behind him and came to stand a few feet to his side, close enough to be part of the same moment, far enough to let him face it on his own. And the silence stretched again, but this time it was different, not uncertain, not waiting for something to begin, but holding the weight of something already understood. And Ethan lifted his chin slightly, his shoulders settling into a stillness that was not rigid, not defensive, but grounded. And he spoke, his voice carrying across the quiet space without force, without strain. "I remember," he said, and the words did not echo, they did not need to, because they landed where they were meant to. And for a long moment, nothing changed, no movement, no sound beyond the faint shift of wind across the open land. And then, slowly, the rider at the front inclined his head, just once, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than any display of force ever could. And the others followed, not in perfect unison, not as a show, but as acknowledgement, and Ethan did not step back, did not look away. He held his ground, not as the man the town believed him to be, not as the boy he had once been, but as something between the two, something that had finally chosen where it stood. And beside him, Ayanna watched without speaking, her gaze steady, not proud, not relieved, just certain. Because this had never been about whether he would fight, it had always been about whether he would remember. And now that he had, there was nothing left to force, nothing left to prove, only what he would do with it next. And the night settled quietly over Dust Hollow, carrying with it the sense that something unseen had just been set right, not through strength, not through struggle, but through a man finally choosing to stand where he once promised he would. The night did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly over Dust Hollow, the last light stretching thin across the horizon before fading into something softer, something quieter, and the riders remained for a moment longer, not out of doubt, not out of hesitation, but as if honoring the stillness that had just taken shape. And then, without a word, without a signal that most would recognize, the man at the front turned his horse gently, the movement calm, deliberate, and one by one the others followed, not in haste, not in retreat, but in a kind of quiet completion, like something that had come to an end exactly the way it was meant to. And Ethan stood where he was, watching them go, not counting them, not tracking their direction, just letting the moment pass through him without trying to hold it, because for the first time in years, he did not feel the need to control what came next. And beside him, Ayanna did not move either, her gaze following the riders only until they reached the edge of sight. And then she turned her attention back to him, not waiting, not expecting, simply present in the same way she had been since she stepped through the saloon doors. And the town behind them began to breathe again, slowly, uncertainly, the quiet murmur of voices returning, footsteps shifting, chairs scraping against wood as men tried to make sense of what they had just witnessed without ever fully understanding it. And Ethan let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in relief, but in something closer to release. And he glanced down at his hands, empty now, no bracelet, no glass, nothing to anchor him except the ground beneath his boots. And he nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something that no longer needed to be spoken. And then he turned, not toward the saloon, not toward the town, but toward her. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because there were no words that could carry what had just passed between them without making it smaller than it was. And Ethan's eyes softened, not with apology, not with regret, but with something quieter, something earned. And he reached into his pocket, slow, deliberate, and pulled out the bracelet, the same worn leather, the same uneven cuts. And he held it out to her, not as something he was giving back, but as something he was finally returning to its place. And she looked at it, then at him, and there was a flicker of something in her gaze now, not surprise, not relief, but recognition that this was not the same man who had once walked away without looking back. And she did not take it immediately. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance that had remained between them, and her hand rose, not to take the bracelet, but to guide his hand down, gently, until it rested at his side again. And she shook her head once, a small movement, but certain. "It was never mine to keep," she said softly, and the words settled in the space between them with a quiet truth that needed no explanation. And Ethan looked at the bracelet in his hand, then back at her, and for the first time, there was no confusion in him, no hesitation, only understanding. And he slipped it back into his pocket, not as something forgotten, but as something carried forward. And the wind moved lightly through the street, lifting a thin layer of dust that caught the fading light. And Ayanna turned slightly, her gaze shifting toward the open land beyond the town, the direction the riders had gone, and then back to him. And she spoke one last time, her voice steady, but softer than before. "The first snow is not far," she said, and there was no demand in it, no expectation, only a simple truth placed where it could be heard. And Ethan nodded once, his expression calm, grounded, and he did not answer with words, because he did not need to. And she held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and began to walk, not waiting to see if he would follow, not asking him to, just moving forward the same way she had come, certain, in her path. And Ethan stood there as she took her first steps away, the town behind him, the open land ahead, and for a heartbeat, the world felt balanced on that single moment. And then he moved, not quickly, not dramatically, just one step forward, and then another, leaving the doorway, leaving the distance, carrying nothing in his hands but everything he had finally chosen not to leave behind. And somewhere far beyond the edge of the town, where the land opened wide and the sky felt closer than it should, the first hint of cold waited in the air, quiet, patient, and certain that this time, he would not turn away. They said a man's fate could be sealed before he even knew he'd made a choice. And Ethan Cole understood that the moment the rope tightened around his wrists and 20 silent Apache warriors formed a circle in the dust around him, not one raising a weapon, not one speaking, just watching, waiting, as the morning sun burned low over the horizon and the woman stepped forward, calm as still water, her dark eyes fixed on him like she had known him all her life. And she said only 4 words, "This is the man." And somehow those words carried more weight than any gun ever could. 12 hours earlier, there had been nothing but wind and horses and the quiet creak of wood as Ethan pushed open the stable door just before dawn, expecting nothing more than the smell of hay and leather. But instead he saw her lying there in the corner stall, curled slightly on the straw like someone who had run out of road, her dress torn at the edges, dust clinging to her skin, one hand still wrapped tight around a small blade even in sleep. And for a long second he didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched the slow rise and fall of her shoulders. Because out here, strangers didn't just appear in your barn unless trouble had ridden them in. He stepped closer, boots soft against the dirt floor, keeping his hands visible the way his mother once taught him, the early light cutting through the wooden slats and falling across her face. And that's when her eyes opened, fast, sharp, not confused but ready, the blade lifting just enough to remind him that whatever had chased her hadn't broken her, and whatever she wasn't helpless. "You're on my land," he said quietly, voice low, steady, not a threat, not a welcome either, just truth. And she didn't answer, only watched him like she was measuring something he couldn't see, the distance between them holding tight like a drawn wire. Then he noticed the blood, not much, but enough. A dark stain along her side where the fabric had torn. An instinct pulled at him stronger than caution, the kind that doesn't ask permission, just moves, and he reached for a clean cloth hanging nearby, slow, deliberate, giving her time to stop him if she chose to, but she didn't, not at first, her grip on the blade tightening, her breath steady, her eyes never leaving his. And when his hand finally brushed the edge of the torn fabric to check the wound, something shifted in the air, subtle but real, like a line had been crossed that neither of them fully understood. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying dust across the open land, and somewhere far off, hoofbeats began to echo faint and distant, too measured to be wild, too many to be chance, and Ethan felt it before he heard it clearly, that quiet warning the land gives a man who's lived on it long enough. And he realized then that finding her in his stable wasn't the beginning of something simple. It was the middle of something already moving, something that had rules he didn't know yet, rules he might have already broken the moment he chose to help instead of walk away. The hoofbeats grew louder, no longer a distant echo but a steady rhythm pressing against the quiet morning, and Ethan Cole did not need to step outside to know they were coming straight for his land, the kind of riders who did not wander by accident and did not turn back without reason. And inside the stable the woman heard it too, her head tilting slightly, eyes sharpening as if she could measure distance by sound alone. And for the first time she spoke, her voice low but clear. "They found me. Faster than I thought." And there was no fear in it, only calculation, the kind that comes from someone who has already survived worse. Ethan glanced toward the open door where dust was beginning to drift in thin lines across the ground, then back to her, weighing something he could not yet name, because turning her out now would be the simple choice, the safe one. The one that kept a man out of other people's trouble. But nothing about the way she stood, steady despite the wound, felt like something he could hand over without consequence. "How many?" he asked, and she answered without hesitation. "Enough," which told him more than any number could, and the silence that followed stretched tight between them until he let out a slow breath and made a decision that would not look like much to anyone else, but would carry weight he would not understand until it was too late. You stay here, he said, nodding toward the deeper stall where shadows held longer. Do not move unless I tell you. And for a moment she studied him again, searching for weakness, for deceit, for anything that would justify not trusting him. But she found none, or not enough, and the blade in her hand lowered just a fraction. Outside, the riders came into view through the slats, 3 shapes at first, then 5 as they spread out across the yard, their horses slowing to a controlled walk. Not the rush of men chasing blindly, but the certainty of those who already knew where to stop. And Ethan stepped out into the sunlight, closing the stable door behind him with a quiet finality that felt heavier than it should have. His posture relaxed but deliberate, hands loose at his sides, every movement chosen to say he had nothing to hide, even when he did. The lead rider watched him for a long second before speaking, his voice calm, almost polite. We are looking for someone. And Ethan gave a small nod as if that were the most ordinary thing in the world. Plenty of people pass through, he said, keeping his tone even. None stopped here. And the man's gaze did not leave his face, measuring, weighing, searching for the smallest crack, while the others circled slightly, their presence pressing in without a single raised voice, without a single threat. Just quiet pressure that asked for truth without ever demanding it. Behind the stable door, the woman remained still, listening, every breath controlled, every movement held back, because she understood something Ethan was only beginning to learn, that out here, survival was not about who was stronger, but about who could choose when not to move. And as the wind shifted again, carrying the scent of dust and leather between them, the man in front gave a faint smile that did not reach his eyes and said, If you are lying, it will not end well. And Ethan met his gaze without flinching, not because he was fearless, but because he had already stepped past the point where fear could change anything. And somewhere behind him, unseen, the woman he chose not to betray closed her eyes for just a moment, as if marking the exact second when a stranger became something else entirely. The riders did not leave right away, and that was what made the silence stretch tighter than any threat could, because men who intended to ride on would have done so already. But these men lingered, their horses shifting slowly in the dust, their eyes moving from the house to the stable to the open land beyond, as if they were reading something written in the air. And Ethan Cole stood where he was, steady, patient, giving them nothing but time to doubt themselves, even as his own thoughts moved faster. Beneath the surface, counting distance, counting shadows, listening for the smallest sound behind him that might betray what he had chosen to protect. The lead rider finally turned his head slightly, not toward Ethan, but toward the stable door, and that small movement carried more weight than any shouted order, and Ethan felt it like a change in the wind, subtle but undeniable. The moment when a situation stopped being balanced and started to tip, and he spoke before the man could, just enough to pull attention back to him. You have business with me, say it plain, his voice calm, almost tired, like a man with nothing to prove. And the rider's gaze returned to him, slow, deliberate, and for a second something like curiosity flickered there. A woman passed this way. The man said, She does not belong out here alone. And the words were simple, but the meaning beneath them was not. And Ethan gave a small shrug that could have meant anything. Plenty of people do not belong out here, he replied, does not stop them. And that earned the faintest shift among the others. Not quite approval, not quite warning, just acknowledgement that he was not an easy man to read. Behind the door, the woman remained still, but her fingers tightened slightly around the blade, not out of panic, but calculation, because she understood now that the man outside had not only chosen to hide her, he had chosen to stand in front of that choice and carry it, and that was not something she had expected. From him, not from anyone like him. The wind shifted again, pushing the stable door just enough to make it creak, a soft sound. Barely there, but in a place this quiet it might as well have been a signal, and every head turned at once, not sharply, not violently, just enough to mark that they had heard it. And Ethan felt the moment close in, that narrow space where truth and consequence stand face to face. And for the first time since the riders arrived, he took a single step forward, not toward them, but just enough to change the angle, to place himself more directly between them and the stable, a small movement, easy to miss, but impossible to ignore once seen. The lead rider watched that step carefully, his expression unreadable, and then, slowly, he smiled, not with warmth, not with threat, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had just learned something important without needing to be told, and he nodded once, as if to himself, before speaking again. If she is here, she will not stay hidden long. And Ethan met his gaze without answering, because anything he said now would matter less than what had already been done, and the man turned his horse slightly, not away, but to the side, as if giving space rather than leaving. And that was when Ethan understood that this was not over, not even close, because men like these did not walk away from uncertainty. They waited for it to reveal itself. Inside the stable, the woman opened her eyes fully now, her breathing still quiet, controlled, but something had changed in the way she held herself, something that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Because the man outside had just crossed another line without knowing its name, and out here, lines like that did not disappear. They followed you, shaped you, bound you to things you could not yet see. And as the dust settled, and the horses shifted, and the silence returned heavier than before, she understood something he did not, that the choice he made in that moment was no longer his alone to carry. The riders did not press forward, and that was the part that unsettled Ethan more than anything else, because men who wanted something badly usually took it. But these men waited, their patience stretching across the yard like a shadow that did not move, and the lead rider rested his hand lightly on the saddle horn as if time itself belonged to him, his eyes drifting once more to the stable door before returning to Ethan with a quiet certainty that made the air feel thinner. "You keep your land well," the man said after a long pause, his tone almost conversational, as though they were discussing weather instead of truth, and Ethan gave a small nod. "I do what I can," he answered, keeping his voice even. But inside he felt the shift, the way the conversation had changed from questions to observations, and that meant the man was no longer searching, he was confirming. One of the riders dismounted slowly, not in a hurry, not in challenge, just stepping down with the ease of someone who expected no resistance. And he walked a few paces across the yard, boots stirring the dust in soft circles, his gaze moving over the ground, the fence, the water trough, reading signs that most men would never notice. And Ethan understood then that silence alone would not protect what he had chosen to hide, because men like these did not need words to find what they were looking for. The stable door shifted again under a light push of wind, just enough to open a fraction, and through that narrow gap a sliver of shadow moved. So small it could have been nothing, but in a place like this nothing was ever just nothing, and the man on the ground stopped, his head tilting slightly, as if listening to something beneath the surface, and Ethan took another step, casual, unforced, placing himself directly in the line between the man and the door, not blocking it outright, but enough to say without speaking that whatever was behind, it was not open to strangers. "You are careful," the lead rider said quietly, and there was something new in his voice now, not suspicion, not accusation, but recognition, the kind one man gives another when he sees a line drawn and understands its meaning. Ethan did not answer, because there was nothing left to say that would not give more than he intended, and the man on the ground looked up, meeting the rider's eyes for a brief moment, and something passed between them without a word, a decision made in silence. And then he stepped back, brushing dust from his hands as if the search had ended, though no one had declared it so. The lead rider straightened slightly in the saddle, his gaze lingering on Ethan a moment longer before he gave a small nod, not of agreement, not of surrender, but of acknowledgement, and he turned his horse just enough to signal movement, and one by one the others followed, not hurried, not reluctant, simply leaving as though the land had offered them all it would for now. Ethan watched them go without shifting his stance, counting the distance as they moved, listening until the sound of hooves softened and stretched into the open plains, and only when the last rider became a shape against the horizon did he allow himself to breathe fully again. Behind him, the stable remained quiet, the kind of quiet that holds more than absence. And when he finally reached for the door and pushed it open, the light fell across the straw where she stood, no longer hidden, no longer still, her eyes on him with a depth that had not been there before. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because something had changed in that silence outside, something that had bound them in a way neither had asked for. And as the wind moved gently through the slats and carried the fading echo of distant riders away, she lowered the blade in her hand completely for the first time, not as surrender, but as a choice. For a long moment neither of them moved, the quiet inside the stable settling heavier than before, not the kind of silence that comes from safety, but the kind that follows a choice that cannot be undone. And Ethan Cole leaned one shoulder lightly against the wooden frame, studying her the same way he had when he first found her, except now there was something different in his eyes, not suspicion, not caution alone, but a recognition that whatever stood in front of him was no longer just a stranger passing through. She stepped forward slowly, no sudden motion, no threat, the blade now hanging loose at her side as if it had already served its purpose. And when she spoke, her voice carried none of the tension it had before, only a steady calm that felt older than the morning itself. "You should not have done that," she said, not as a warning, not as blame, but as a simple truth placed between them. Ethan gave a faint breath that might have been a quiet laugh if there had been any humor in it, too. "Late for that," he replied, pushing himself upright, his gaze drifting briefly toward the open land where the riders had disappeared, then back to her. "You want to tell me why they were looking for you?" And she did not answer right away, her eyes lowering just slightly, as if weighing how much of that truth belonged to him now. The light shifted through the slats, catching on something at her neck that had been hidden before, a small silver pendant resting against her skin, worn but carefully kept, its surface etched with markings Ethan did not fully understand but recognized as something that carried meaning beyond decoration, and without thinking he nodded toward it. "That theirs?" he asked, and her hand rose instinctively to cover it, not defensive, but protective, the way someone guards something that is not easily replaced. "It was my mother's," she said quietly, and there was a pause after that, a space where more could have been said but was not, and Ethan did not press. Because out here, stories were given, not taken. She lifted her gaze again, meeting his directly. "They believe I belong somewhere I will not return to," she continued, and there was no anger in her tone, only certainty. "And now they believe you have stepped into that place." And Ethan frowned slightly, not fully understanding, but feeling the weight of it settle anyway. "I gave you a place to rest," he said. "That is all." And for the first time something almost like a smile touched her. Expression, small, brief, but real. "That is not how it works for us," she said. The words hung there, quiet but firm, and Ethan felt the ground shift beneath a rule he had never been taught. Because where he came from, a man could offer help and walk away clean. But here, it seemed, help carried a different cost. Outside, the wind moved softly across the yard, brushing against the stable walls with a low, steady sound. And in that moment the world felt larger than the space between them, filled with things neither of them had said yet. "You can still leave," Ethan said after a while, his voice lower now, not pushing, not pulling, just offering. And she looked at him in a way that made the answer clear before she spoke it. "No," she said simply, and there was no hesitation, no doubt, only decision. "Not anymore." And as those words settled into the quiet, Ethan understood something he had not before, that the riders had not left because they believed him. They had left because something else had already been set in motion, something that did not end with hoofbeats fading into the distance. And as he stood there, facing the woman he had chosen not to turn away, he realized that whatever line he had crossed was no longer behind him. It was ahead, waiting. The wind did not settle after that. It moved through the open land in slow, steady breaths, carrying the faint trace of those riders long after they had disappeared from sight. And Ethan Cole stepped out of the stable without speaking, his boots pressing into the dry earth as if he needed to feel something solid beneath him, something that still belonged to him alone, because inside that barn, something had shifted that he could not name, and it followed him now like a shadow he could not outrun. Behind him, she stepped into the doorway, not hiding anymore, not asking for permission, the morning light catching in her dark hair and along the silver pendant at her throat. And for the first time, she stood fully in his world, not as a stranger passing through, but as someone who had chosen to remain, and that choice carried a weight neither of them had yet measured. "They will not come back the same way," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the horizon in a way that told him she was seeing more than distance. She was reading patterns, memory, intention, and Ethan glanced toward the hills beyond his land. The long stretch of open ground that usually meant safety through emptiness, but now felt like a space waiting to be crossed again. "Then how will they come?" he asked, and she did not answer right away, her gaze lowering briefly to the ground between them before lifting again, steady, certain, "Not as hunters," she said, "as witnesses," and the words settled differently than he expected, not sharp, not threatening, but heavier, as if it belonged to something older than either of them. Ethan frowned slightly, folding his arms as he leaned back against the stable post. "Witnesses to what?" he asked, and she took a step forward, closing the distance just enough that her voice did not need to rise. "To what has already been done," she said, and there was no accusation in it, no blame, just a statement of fact that did not ask for agreement. The horses shifted softly in their stalls behind them, the quiet sounds of breath and movement grounding the moment in something real, something ordinary, but the space between them no longer felt simple, and Ethan let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting again to the pendant at her neck. "You keep saying I stepped into something," he said, "then tell me what it is," and she held his eyes for a long second, as if deciding whether he was ready to hear it, or whether it would matter if he was not. "Where I come from," she began, her voice calm. "Even a man who gives shelter when he does not have to is not just offering kindness." She paused, her hand resting lightly over the pendant. "He is accepting a bond." And Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in resistance to a rule he had never agreed to. "I did not accept anything," he said, and she nodded once, as if she had expected that answer. "That is because you think the choice was only yours," she replied. The words did not come sharp, but they landed anyway, quiet and certain, and Ethan looked away for a moment, out across the land he had worked for years to keep simple, to keep his own. And he realized that simplicity had already begun to slip from his grasp the moment he chose not to walk away. "So what happens now?" he asked. After a while, and she did not hesitate this time. "Now they return," she said, "and they will not ask you what you meant." She met his eyes again, steady as the horizon. "They will ask what you will do next." And the wind moved between them once more, carrying the weight of that question into the open space around them, where there was no longer anywhere for it to disappear. The day did not move the way it used to. It stretched slower, heavier, as if the land itself was waiting for something to arrive. And Ethan Cole felt it in the way the wind circled instead of passing through, in the way the horses shifted more than usual, restless without knowing why. And he stood near the fence line with his hat low against the sun, watching the open horizon where nothing yet appeared, but everything already felt different. Behind him, she moved quietly, not hiding, not lingering, simply existing in his space with a calm that did not belong to someone being hunted, and that calm unsettled him more than fear ever could, because fear made sense, fear followed rules, but this did not. "You should prepare," she said after a long silence, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without effort, and Ethan did not turn right away, his eyes still fixed on the distance. "For what?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would not be something he could measure with time or distance. "For being seen," she replied, and the words hung there, quiet and certain, and he let out a slow breath before finally turning to face her, studying the way she stood, steady, grounded, as if the land beneath her feet belonged to her in a way it never had to him. "I have been seen before," he said, a faint edge in his tone, not defensive, but firm. "I have lived out here long enough to know what that means," and she gave a small shake of her head, not dismissing him, but correcting something he had not yet understood. "Not like this," she said. The sun climbed higher, casting sharper light across the yard, and for a moment everything looked too clear, too defined, as if there was no place left for things to hide. And then Ethan heard it, not loud, not sudden, but there, a low, distant rhythm that did not belong to wind or cattle, and his eyes narrowed slightly as he turned back toward the horizon, where at first there was nothing, and then, slowly, shapes began to form, not scattered, not rushed, but aligned, moving with a quiet precision that spoke of purpose rather than pursuit. They did not come fast, they did not raise dust in wild clouds. They approached in a line that held its shape, rider, after rider, until Ethan lost count without realizing it. Because the number no longer mattered. What mattered was the stillness between them, the way they moved like one thought instead of many. Beside him, she stepped forward, her gaze fixed on them without hesitation, without surprise, and Ethan noticed that she did not reach for the blade at her side, did not prepare to run, did not even shift her stance, and that told him more than any words could. These are not the same men, he said quietly, more to himself than to her, and she nodded once. No, she answered. They are the ones who decide. And the distance between the riders and the ranch closed slowly, deliberately, until they stopped just beyond the fence line. No one crossing, no one calling out, only watching. And Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but the weight of being measured by something he did not fully understand. One rider moved forward then, older than the rest, his posture straight but unforced, his presence carrying a kind of authority that did not need to be spoken. And he looked at Ethan, not with hostility, not with suspicion, but with a calm that made the air feel still around him. And then his gaze shifted to the woman standing beside Ethan, and for the first time since they arrived, something changed, subtle, but unmistakable, as if a piece of a story had just fallen into place. No one spoke, not at first, and that silence stretched long enough to become its own language, and Ethan realized that whatever came next would not be asked. It would be understood, and as the wind moved once more through the open land, carrying the quiet presence of those who had come not to chase, but to witness, he stood where he was, knowing that stepping back now was no longer an option. No one gave a command, and yet something shifted the moment the older rider stepped forward, his horse stopping just short of the fence, as if even the animal understood there was a line that could not be crossed without meaning. And Ethan Cole felt the weight of that invisible boundary settle into the ground beneath his boots, not drawn by wire or wood, but by something older, something carried in the stillness of the men who waited behind it. The rider studied him first, not quickly, not with suspicion, but with a patience that felt like judgment without accusation. And then his gaze moved to the woman beside him, and the air changed in a way Ethan could not explain, as if the world had just aligned around a truth he had not yet been told. The woman stepped forward then, just enough to stand even with Ethan instead of behind him, and she did not lower her eyes, did not speak in haste. She simply existed in that space with a quiet certainty that matched the man before her, and for a moment the two of them looked at each other without words, a conversation passing between them that needed no voice. When she finally spoke, her tone was steady, respectful, but unyielding. "I came here by my own will," she said, and the words carried across the short distance with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And the older man inclined his head slightly, not surprised, not pleased, just acknowledging what had already been decided. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, the kind that did not need to be raised to be heard. "And he gave you shelter," he said, not a question. And she nodded once, her hand resting lightly over the pendant at her neck as if anchoring herself to something deeper than the moment. Ethan stood still, his eyes moving between them, feeling like he had stepped into a conversation that had begun long before he arrived. And he opened his mouth to speak, to explain, to correct whatever misunderstanding had taken shape. But the older man lifted a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to hold the moment where it was. And Ethan felt himself pause without knowing why. "In our way," the man continued, his gaze returning to Ethan now, steady and clear. "A man who gives shelter when there is no obligation does more than offer kindness." He let the words settle before finishing. "He accepts the path that follows." And Ethan felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not anger, but resistance to a meaning he had never agreed to carry. "I did not ask for that," he said, his voice firm, controlled, and the man did not argue, did not correct him, only nodded once, as if that answer was expected, as if it had already been considered. Beside him, the woman did not look away, her expression calm but certain, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer now, but no less clear. "It was not asked of you," she said, "it was chosen." And the difference between those two things settled heavily into the space between them, because one could be refused, but the other could not be undone. The riders behind the older man remained still, silent, their presence forming a quiet wall that did not press forward, did not threaten, only witnessed, and Ethan realized then that this was not a confrontation, not a demand. It was something else entirely, something that did not require force because it had already taken hold. The older man shifted slightly in his saddle, his eyes still on Ethan. "You will not be forced," he said, and there was no deception in it, no hidden edge, only truth. "But you will be seen for what you have done." And the words carried a weight that was not judgment, but recognition, the kind that followed a man whether he accepted it or not. The wind moved again, softer now, brushing across the land as if nothing had changed, but Ethan knew better, because standing there between them, he understood that whatever came next would not be decided by what he said, but by what he chose to stand with. And as the silence returned, deeper than before, he realized that for the first time in years, the land beneath his feet no longer felt entirely his own. The silence did not break all at once, it settled deeper, like dust after a long ride. And Ethan Cole stood there with the weight of every word still hanging in the air, not pushing him, not forcing him, but leaving him with something heavier than either, a choice that no one would take from him and no one would release him from either. He looked at the older man first, then at the line of riders behind him, and finally at the woman beside him. And for a moment the world narrowed to that small space between where he stood and where he could step, because out here a man was measured not by what he said, but by where he chose to remain. The wind moved softly across the yard, brushing against the fence, the stable, the open land beyond, and Ethan felt it pass through him like a reminder of every year he had spent alone, every decision made to keep his life simple, contained, his own, and he realized now that none of that had prepared him for this, for a moment where walking away would be easier, cleaner, but would leave something behind that could not be picked up again. He let out a slow breath, his shoulders easing not from relief, but from acceptance, and without speaking, without looking for permission, he took a single step forward, not toward the riders, not away from them, but to stand fully beside her, his position clear in a way words could never match. The older man watched that movement carefully, and for the first time there was the faintest shift in his expression, not approval, not surprise, but recognition, the kind given when a question has been answered without needing to be asked again. Beside Ethan, she did not move at first, as if allowing him that space to choose without influence. And then, slowly, she turned her head to look at him, her eyes steady, searching not for proof, but for truth. And whatever she found there was enough, because she did not speak, did not question, she simply remained where she was. The riders behind the older man did not react, did not press forward, their stillness holding firm, and after a long moment, the older man inclined his head once, a gesture small enough to miss, but clear enough to carry meaning, and he turned his horse slightly, not as retreat, but as closure, and one by one the others followed, their lines shifting as they began to move away, not hurried, not reluctant, just leaving as if the moment had reached its end. Ethan watched them go, the sound of hooves soft against the earth, fading slowly into the distance, and he did not move, did not call out, because there was nothing left to say, not to them, not to himself. The land grew quiet again, the kind of quiet that comes after something has been decided, and the wind returned to its usual path, carrying nothing but open space with it. But Ethan knew it was not the same, because he was not standing there alone anymore. After a while, he turned his head slightly, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence beside him, and she stood there with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. But now it was different, not guarded, not measured, just steady, like something that had found where it was meant to be. Neither of them spoke, because whatever this was did not need to be named yet. And as the sun moved higher over the land and the shadows shortened beneath their feet, Ethan understood something he had not before, that out here, belonging was not something a man claimed, and it was not something taken from him either. It was something he chose to stand with, and once he did, it stayed, quiet as the land itself, and just as permanent.